Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in political philosophy. Now, we've spent the last few lessons talking specifically and exclusively about liberalism. And this is just sort of part of our introductory series of lessons, where for the first 20 or so videos on political philosophy, we will spend time focusing on issues relating to ideologies. And we were going to spend some time focusing specifically on liberalism, on conservatism, and then spending a little bit of time looking at socialism. And we've spent, like I said, most of our time focusing on liberalism as a political ideology. This lesson is going to move on away from that particular topic and start to talk about conservatism. Now, we're going to sort of jump back and forth in relation to conservatism over the next couple of lessons. Specifically take a bit of an introduction in this video, talk a little bit about Thomas Hobbes, who wasn't a conservative in the traditional sense, but that laid quite a lot of the groundwork for conservatism, and then focus on Hobbes in even more detail in the next lesson. Before, like I said, moving on to looking at socialism, and then also looking at a variety of different topics within political philosophy. So the idea of civil society, distributive justice, the nature of the state, and these kinds of questions. That will be the sort of tail end of these lessons. So really, as a basic overview, it's quite interesting to try and define conservatism, because you can define liberalism quite simply. You can define liberalism by reference to a variety of different ideas and ideological principles that liberalism essentially enshrines. You have things relating to economic freedom, free markets, the individualist freedom, the nature of civil rights and constitutionalism, the idea of human nature being one of egotistical individualism. All of these ideas are relatively simple to think about in relation to liberalism. Conservatism is a little bit different, though, because you could almost argue that conservatism exists almost as a reaction to radical political change, rather than being something of an ideology in and of itself. So conservatism seems to respond to and react to radical political change that takes place, and obviously react hostilely, in a hostile manner, against radical political change. So we start to see conservatism begin to develop out of the revolutions of Europe and the Americas. So, for example, the American Revolution it comes to mind. You also have the French Revolution, you have the English Revolution, and then as we go further and further and further afield, and we go into the sort of 1800s and the 1900s, you have the Italians and German revolutions, you have the Russian Revolution. All of these different kinds of things signal a quite substantial change in terms of politics. So taking the Russian Revolution in 1917 as an example, we see the collapse of monarchy and the instigation of a communist dictatorship, the quite significant volte-face, if you will, in relation to ideological principles. Now, the concept of conservatism and the ideas of conservatism that we would sort of think about and relate to today date back and start to take shape following the French Revolution. Now, this image here is a picture of somebody by the name of Edmund Burke, who wrote a relatively small pamphlet titled "On the Evils of Revolution." I have it on my shelf behind me. And you could sort of get to the idea of what Edmund Burke is coming to in that regard, in relation to this idea of reacting to radical political change, on the evils of revolution, being particularly hostile to the nature of revolutionary change. Now, generally, what we see here is that if we were to just sort of dilute the French Revolution and the history of the French Revolution to its most constituent basic parts, we see that the purpose of the French Revolution was to replace the monarchy, to replace the idea of monarchy with the idea of constitutionalism and a written constitution, in a similar sense to what the American Revolution was, or even the German Revolution to an extent, and the Russian Revolution. Now, conservatives began to promote ideas in response to this view of revolution, and to this view towards a written constitution, and promoted ideas such as the idea of changing to conserve. According to Edmund Burke, a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. And so when we think about this, we sort of flip conservatism on its head, whereas conservatism is a reaction to quite radical political change, or at least its origins come out of a significant hostile reaction to radical political change. The idea of conservatism in and of itself as an ideology is one that does promote and does accept the idea of political change. And the reason why it wants to and accepts the view towards political change is because of this idea of conserving. Edmund Burke makes the point that if you want to conserve the basic values and traditional ideas of a state or a culture or a people's, you have to be able to make change, because a state without the means of change is a state without the means of its conservation, is essentially the point that Edmund Burke is making. Now, Thomas Hobbes is an individual who we will get to in the next lesson in far more detail, but I'm just going to spend the rest of this lesson focusing a little bit on Thomas Hobbes, because essentially, as opposed to liberal thinkers and to liberalisms, conservatives and conservatism believes that human nature is fundamentally limited and fundamentally flawed. Remember, one of the key tenets of political philosophy is this understanding of what human nature essentially does, and how society is shaped by this idea of human nature. And different views of human nature will inform different ways in which you think about political issues. Thomas Hobbes, for example, takes a quite skeptical view of human nature in his understanding of the state of nature. Now, I want to just stress again that Thomas Hobbes isn't a conservative. He wouldn't have called himself a conservative. Conservatism didn't really exist as a political ideology when Thomas Hobbes was writing. But Hobbesian ideas and Hobbesian analysis is quite instrumental in the development of conservatism, such that you wouldn't label Thomas Hobbes a conservative, but you would at the very least, talk about, in looking at the origins of conservatism, talk about the ideas that Thomas Hobbes raises in works such as that of Leviathan. So Thomas Hobbes was writing partially in response to the English Civil Wars. These took place between around 1642 and 1651. Of course, the French Revolution takes place a good century later. Now, his political philosophy is heavily informed by his opinions of this conflict, and you can see that in his writings. In his writings, knowing and understanding what it's like to live through a revolution and a civil war and a collapse of monarchical authority sees him sort of shift towards and propose ideas that really advocate for the maintenance of monarchical sovereign authority. And one of the things that Thomas Hobbes famously talks about is the concept of the state of nature, the idea of a political society that exists without the existence of the state, or at least prior to the existence of the state. And he famously argues that the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, like I said, we'll get into the reasons behind this basic idea and look at Leviathan in the next lesson in more detail, and we will take bigger passages of Thomas Hobbes' works and writings and provide something of an overview of, or at least provide something of a detailed analysis of his basic political thought. But for now, I just want to talk about this idea of the state of nature and the links that Thomas Hobbes really makes. Because Hobbes argues that the state of nature would be similar to the state of war, an idea of a society at war with itself or with others, due to the fact that individuals are selfish and their selfish desires for power will take shape and eventually lead to a situation where, like he says, as I pointed out in this previous slide, that the idea of life in this particular environment would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.